Some bands hit the world stage with a whimper and others with a bang. We're going to be having a look at some of the most influential debut albums in my collection that happen to be some of my favourites too, to see how they all started and what shape the world around them took since their release. So first up, we've got Marquee Moon by Television. This album was released on February the 8th, 1977 by Elektra Records. It was a band that had been touring quite successfully on the sort of scene in New York during the earlier part of the 1970s at all the cool places like CBGB's until they were eventually picked up by Elektra Records and released this amazing debut album. It was one that the critics at the time found it very difficult to pigeonhole. Some people were calling it sort of art punk or post-punk or kind of new wave, but others called it rock because, you know, they could play instruments unlike the punks. It was hard to pinpoint at the time, but what it did turn out to do was actually be an incredibly influential album on the alternative rock scene, really, that followed, you know, through the 80s, into the 90s, and even up to today. A lot of bands will cite this album as being one of the things that shaped their early musical influences and got them into playing the kind of music that they do. Next up, we've got Pearl Jam's 10, released on August the 27th, 1991. This was really... Pearl Jam were formed after the sort of dissolution of Mother Love Bone. So Jeff Ament and Stone Gossard decided they were going to reform a band, started to audition for other members. One of the... geezers that turned up to do the audition to be the singer in this band, he was a bloke who turned out to be Eddie Vedder, who of course went on after this album and the other albums he did with Pearl Jam to become one of the most iconic voices from the scene. Of course, the grunge scene had so many really, really great and iconic sort of lead singers. Obviously, you've got Lane Staley and Chris Cornell, Mark Lanegan, Kurt Cobain, and of course Eddie Vedder. And so these were the sort of, real hit makers of that particular genre. And this being released when it was in 1991, it was one of the first ones to gain a sort of appeal, I guess, beyond the sort of scene that it was originally in, and became a worldwide commercial success. And of course, everything that followed with the punk movement with the grunge movement in the years since can be certainly thanked for albums like Pearl Jam's 10, Nirvana Nevermind, and so on. Next up, we've got Definitely Maybe from Oasis, released on the 29th of August, 1994, from a band, a couple of brothers called Liam and Noel Gallagher, from a little outfit in Manchester called Rain. They changed their name shortly afterwards to Oasis and put this album out on Creation Records and really changed the face of British music history at the time. There was a kind of, a rebellion against this our side of the pond, against the grunge scene that was coming in. We wanted to do our own thing. Britpop was it. This was one of the founding and most important albums of that genre-defining album. Is ranked to this day as one of the greatest albums of all time, and certainly one of the most impressive debut albums by any band. It really set the tone and showed the world what we were going to get from Oasis moving forward, and they most certainly didn't disappoint. Of course, we couldn't have a list of greatest debut albums without mentioning Jeff Buckley's Grace. This was released just 5 days prior to the previous album I mentioned, Definitely Maybe, released on the 25th of August, 1994. This was the solo album, the only album that Jeff Buckley actually managed to complete during his lifetime. He was sadly and tragically drowned in a freak accident just 3 years later, while still touring this album and still trying to get it off the ground and still trying to finish up the second album that would never be completed. During his life, this never found the critical acclaim amongst the public that he wanted, but Jimmy Page at Led Zeppelin actually said that this was one of his favourite albums of all time and possibly the greatest album of the decade when he was interviewed about this, pretty much when it came out. It took a long time, though, for it to reach the broad appeal that it deserved, only reaching double platinum some decade and a half after he died. But nevertheless, its influence has been long-lasting, and the music is beautiful, and the poignancy around it, and the story of Jeff is one that is a markedly important point in musical history. So there we are, Jeff Buckley's Grace. So now we come to Guns N' Roses' debut album. Of course, it's Appetite for Destruction, one of the most recognisable album covers of all time. This was released on the 21st of July, 1987 on Geffen Records, and is probably one of the most famous debut albums of all time, I would have said. Although at the time, it didn't immediately reach the critical acclaim that you would imagine it would. Of course, nowadays everybody knows it. It's gone, 6 times platinum. But at the time, in its first week, it sold like 50,000 copies, and then it drifted up, during through the charts a little bit, but never really found success for about a year and a half. It took the band and the label really pushing it to, because MTV didn't want to play the videos, the radio didn't really want to play it, and so they thought they were, going to make an album that was, sort of pretty much non-commercial and wouldn't really go anywhere. Of course, when people started to hear the songs and started to see the videos on MTV, I think Sweet Child of Mine became the most requested video on MTV. People started buying the music when they did start to get played on the radio, and of course the rest is history. This has become one of the most iconic albums of all time, genre-defining album, really impressive debut from Guns N' Roses. Right, never mind the bollocks. Here comes the Sex Pistols, released on Virgin Records, October 28th, 1977. This was the manufactured band put together by Malcolm McLaren because he thought that there was there was a market out there, really, for the sort of punk sound that he'd been hearing, and thought he could package it up by getting some likely-looking lads that used to hang around. He had a shop with Vivienne Westwood at the time in London, where sort of these kind of like cool kids would come in with this particular look to them. They'd buy these like leather jackets and spike their hair up and stuff, and you thought, yeah, we should get some of these together and put them in a band. I could make some money out of that. The end result, of course, was one of the most famous albums of all time, and it's really extraordinary, the story, because none of them could play instruments, none of them were any good at music at all, and yet they somehow managed to produce this absolute masterpiece of a record. I mean, tracks like Pretty Vacant, Anarchy in the UK, and the whole it's not just the attitude, it's like it was really well done, and the people on this album could actually play instruments, whereas the people in the band really couldn't. And so the question has remained to this day whether or not it was actually the Sex Pistols who recorded it, or whether or not it was session musicians or other people that actually put this album together. Because this album is rightly one of the greatest albums of all time, and it shouldn't really have been recorded by these sort of wayward young sort of individuals that were facing it. Of course, this was the only album they put out. Sid Vicious's very sad death just a year after this was recorded, and infighting with the band and too much drugs, and there's a whole story around it, which I'll perhaps go into in another video. But regardless, they left us with this, and this is one of the most famous and wonderful debut albums ever made. So next up, we've got another British band. This is Porterhead and Dummy. This is their debut album from the 22nd of August, 1994. This was one of two Bristol bands that really sort of made the trip-hop scene of the time extremely famous. It was them and Massive Attack. The story goes that this album was written on Nina Cherry's kitchen table, and at the time, although it was critically acclaimed when it first came out, the general consensus was that this sort of rather niche Bristolian sound of these kind of like acidy, trippy, bluesy, sort of downbeat type of songs were far too Bristolian in nature to ever be mainstream and popular. And a year later, this had gone double platinum. So it goes to show what the critics know sometimes. But at any rate, Portishead and Dummy is widely recognised as one of the albums that really started that trip-hop scene, or at least made it mainstream and much more popular, with bands like Massive Attack at the time, and went on to sort of forward an entire genre of music, all spinning out of debut album from Portishead, Dummy. And here we have another album that really shaped a generation of music. This is, of course, Ready to Die by Notorious B.I.G. Released not too long. All these seem to be released in like the sort of late summer, early autumn of 1994. I didn't plan that, but it seems to be. There was a lot of music coming out then that shaped the world. But anyway, this one was released on September the 13th, 1994. This is, of course, one of the most seminal albums in hip-hop history. And it's really kind of autobiographical. It's about Biggie's sort of life as a young sort of gangster growing up in New York, and the famous battle at the time, of course, was the East Coast West Coast rivalries between the band artists like sort of Tupac from the East Coast or West Coast, sorry, and then bands like Biggie from the East Coast, which sadly, of course, culminated in both of them and ended up being murdered. This was the only album that he managed to get out during his lifetime, and of course the spooky coincidence of the fact that his follow-up album, which is called Life After Death, he'd completed it in the studio, and it would be released 16 days after he died, and did indeed go on to give Biggie a tremendous life after death. He's widely recognised as one of the greatest rappers of all time, and really shaped the way that the East Coast sound was mainstreamed and was put out at that time. So this was an incredibly influential album. This is where it all started with Tupac. This is the first record that he put out, and it is an absolutely tremendous album from start to finish. So this is 1994's Ready to Die. So next up, we've got an album by some sort of Liverpudlian geezers called the Beatles or something. I don't know whatever happened to them after this. This was released in 1963. It is, of course, Please Please Me by the Beatles. And if you're going to talk about debut albums from that then went on and shaped a generation of music, you really have to include the Beatles in there, because not only were the Beatles themselves the most famous, not just the most famous band in the world, arguably the most famous humans in the world, right? And also were so influential on other bands. It is always wonderful when you see people like Ozzy, for example, coming up and fangirling over Paul McCartney, and it's amazing to see sort of rock stars of that stature coming up and wanting to take their picture with the Beatles, because for them that's where it all started, and so the Beatles were an incredibly influential band at the time. This didn't do hugely. It did all right in the UK. It sort of reached up to about number 17, I think. The singles Love Me Do and Please Please Me did okay, but it didn't really get released in America. Certainly didn't do very well there. I think some of the songs were then re-released and repackaged in other versions later on. But yeah, at the time, this was just a sort of, band, they'd sort of been doing like the sort of skiffle music that was in Liverpool, popular at the time in the 1950s. So this is just like some original songs by, again, people never heard of. Creditors McCartney Lennon, not Lennon McCartney as it later would be, but nobody'd heard who those people were, and the rest of it sort of cover songs. So who knew, right? But it turned out that this was going to be one of the most important albums to be ever released, simply because of who went on to make it. So the Beatles' Please Please Me rounds out my list of, or this list anyway. There's probably going to be another one to come, because you can't just limit it to these, can you? But these are some of my favourite debut albums of all time. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider giving us a subscribe. I am chasing down the 1,000 subscribers. I'm way off at the moment. I've got about 250, I think 270 maybe. But at any rate, that's after 2 weeks of putting out videos. I'm really, really so grateful to all of you that have subscribed so far, because it has been tremendous to have got from sort of zero to where I am in such a short time. I really appreciate it. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next one. Cheers.